And maybe before we get going, maybe Christian, you're the one fella that hasn't been introduced so far today. Christian, you might as well hold on to the mic. Introduce yourself because the three other panelists have already been on stage.
So I'm going to be speaking at some point later in the day, I think next. My name is Christian Posta. I'm a chief architect of cloud native application development at Red Hat.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. So we've already had some great questions. Sort of the format of the panel today is I'll pose a series of questions. I'll try to speed things up. We got a little bit of a late start, but I'll try to pose some questions, and then people in the audience, if you got questions, start to think about them. Maybe write them down. There were excellent questions already, and come up. So I'll probably spend 10 minutes or so just asking some default questions around what I think the audience wants to hear. Now, I think we all of us in the room, work with some sort of line of business owner or the CIO. He or she might be a more business, minded person. What sort of the business drivers advised to have a conversation with whoever, let's say, has the budget within the organization around microservices and containers and maybe APIs near the end of the conversation? What sort of business drivers are you seeing driving the investment in microservices and containers and integration in general? And I'll open up to the panel. I haven't picked a particular person, but anybody want to take that one off the start? Maureen's going to step up. Excellent.
So, business, in a lot of cases, the drivers are sort of described, and then it's up to you to figure out how to implement, unless there's, a huge amount of oversight on it. So, for example, anything tied to digital transformation, you'll hear things about IoT, or you'll hear things about knowing your customer, and, improving cycle times, like operational performance. And so when you hear those sorts of terms and budget being available, and by the way, this is always a problem. There's usually smart people inside the organization on the IT side who know how to pursue a budget to be able to do what they wanted to do for a long time. And so and that's no different right now. And so the issue a little bit is, let's say you want to have a reason to do microservices. That at least is now, right now, roughly 75% of new projects in cloud are microservices based for custom. There's a lot of material out there about how common those are. And so at least you have this maturity aspect of it that's present in the market. But if you want to do something like that, I would argue, especially as more applications are coming to cloud or even being developed internally to support these transformation initiatives, that you should probably do a little bit of stuff yourself first. Like if you want to do a microservice and you're trying to apply it to something that's viewed good budget but urgent, then the first time doing it, it's probably, you're probably going to get turned down at a point. So it's better to find an internal project initially where you can do a proof of concept to make the value on it. Same with APIs, same with any of these initiatives we talked about. Then, do something really small and get the proof point. Use the metrics from that proof point to make the business case and ask. But you're going to find, DX budgets all over the place, and also anything tied to automation. So that's the other huge trend right now, and you can do a lot with that too.
Anybody else on the panel want to chip in?
Yeah, so I think Maureen hit on all the points, all the good points. I try to succinctly describe it as, well, your business, you're constantly looking, or you should be constantly looking for new sources of income, new strategies, new business strategies. This whole idea of innovate. I love Mark Schwartz, who's a former CIO of the U.S. Customs and Immigration Services in the United States. He calls innovation not knowing all the answers, and trying to figure out the right questions to ask. So if we're able to more cheaply and more quickly ask figure out what are the right questions to ask, then we can explore these new business opportunities. And if our IT systems are not economical to be able to do that, then that's going to be an albatross. It's going to slow you down. So, from the perspective of what's the business going to do next, I think that's an approach that aligns with IT that we should be focusing on.
Anybody else want to answer that? Yeah, I think so too. I think, in general, when I talk to executives, it's about speed and agility.
Yeah.
How do I get there faster, and how do I adapt to competitive pressures or change how we operate? And as I said before, Gene Kim actually says the architecture of our custom applications is a key indicator of things such as market cap. So there's some good reasons, and I think we had some good reasons in your deck, Stephen, talking around how do I put this business case together to go to an executive to secure funding for
wanna say
APIs and
one thing.
microservices.
Cutting costs, you can pitch a cost cutter as long as it's dramatic. So, because the companies are trying to find investment from cost savings. And when you think about cutting costs, it might be IT costs. It could be an automation that reduces, repetitive activities. So, when you look at DX, it's all about innovating around being fast, cool, selling more. But when you look at where there's really rapid adoption, it's in this cost efficiency that's playing out in the market. And so surfing the cost efficiency by doing a POC and building the business case around that, it works really well. So don't be afraid to go back to classic IT as a cost cutter, because you can cut a lot out now with the new stuff that's out there.
Okay, good. Who is doing microservices today within their organizations? So a few hands. So I guess a lot of people are sort of on the initial stages of their journey around microservices. How about containerization, like containers and microservices and that relationship? We've kind of touched on it today in various talks, but what is that relationship like between containerization and microservices? How are the two related, and how does maybe containers enable microservices?
Yeah, so containers are interesting. Containers have a place in both the developers world and the operations world. It's sort of this thing that's bridging the gap, or bridging, maybe bringing down the wall. Because operations folks care quite a bit about stability of the services that are running, isolation of the services that are running, the density of the services and the infrastructure, and the reducing waste. But developers care about a way to package their application and reliably move it between developer laptops, from a developer laptop to a dev environment or an IST, UAT environment, but ultimately into production, and whether production is on-prem or who cares where. So I think the more we go toward building applications as smaller units of functionality, the more we're going to face this problem of, well, how do we actually do these deployments? How do we get these operational efficiencies? And we could go off and individually solve them on our own, but I think what's happening in the community, the initiatives that Red Hat's leading in the community as well, are aimed at solving those problems. Anybody else?
So yeah, I think I definitely agree with what Christian just said. I think so microservices there's a lot of great material. A lot of the material, though, especially the earlier stuff, it's changing a little bit, is very focused on how to build a single microservice and do it right and check your 12-factor items off, right? But if you read the 12-factor microservices thing, it's actually about what you do in a single service. So anyone that's built complex systems knows that we didn't just magically solve all the complex dependencies. What we did was we took them away from the individual applications, and now they're in between the applications, right? So I think the dependencies, or the relationship between containers and APIs and microservices, or add APIs in the mix is, we actually have to manage that complexity. We're still building a distributed system. It's actually a more distributed system than before. And so you do need to think about the routing, you need to think about how things connect, how to auto-discover things. And I think that complexity is now there are some pretty good tools around it. That's kind of where Red Hat focuses its energy, but we actually still have a ways to go. And I think to be effective with microservices, it's not just the services themselves that you're building, it's actually how you manage and deploy them at scale.
Good. Is there any questions out there? Just come up to the front when you're
and
available.
one more point real quick, that
Okay.
containers, like we were just talking, so microservices might not be for everything. And I'll come back to that in my talk. But containers solve the generic, how do we package something up, whether it's a microservice or whatever, monolith, mini service, whatever we're calling these things, and reliably move them, reliably build CI/CD pipelines to get things into production. And although there absolutely is lots of complexity now, but that's moving out of the monolith and in between the microservices, we do it for a reason, and I'll come back to that in my talk. But that's not the solution for everything.
Good point.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I think we had one question from the audience. Step up and ask your question.
Thanks. Just wondering if you could offer any sort of comments in general on sort of avoiding all the negative sort of impacts of vendor lock-in and all this, on all these things we're talking about, right? No one wants to throw away their 20 plus years of development and stuff they built and jump on a bandwagon that doesn't have another 20 plus years going forward. You know, you had PaaS as a big sort of trend, and for things like Cloud Foundry and Pivotal being almost like crack cocaine for developers. So it might be a great thing to keep your developers high. It's not necessarily a great thing for the business. So how do you, any words around, you know, avoiding that vendor lock-in and stay with things like conceptual levels and everything else? Whatever you do,
So actually, we were talking about this. There's two things going on right now that are pretty interesting. There's one about vendor lock-in, and then there's also, on the business side, there's a big concern about the risk of developer lock-in. And so a lot of people say, oh, vendor lock-in is so horrible that we're going to do open source. So then, and so then you have a team put together who build a product, and then that they know everything about, and it's because it's internally done, it's really not documented well. There's probably no usability, and so they leave, right? You might have contracted out the development, those people left, or your developers turned out, they did such a great job using everything that they did, that they made a lot more money being attracted to another company, and they used it to get to their next level. So what are you left with? You're left with code that no one knows anything about, and yet it's doing something important. So there's that aspect of it. So there's always this optimization between vendor lock-in and developer lock-in. With vendor lock-in, the things that I look at when I help clients understand this issue is I look for choice. That to me is absolutely, really foundationally important. If I'm, in an environment and there is no choice except for one vendor, I'm afraid. I also really worry about vertical lock-in with cloud. So if you have a SaaS application and then you use all the middleware and you use all the infrastructure, and the vendor decides that you're sticky, your prices go up. So you have to have some control over that. You're also locked into their version control. So competition is the best way to prevent lock-in because it gives you choices. If you start feeling like the vendor that you're using that's strategically important is not going to be doing you any favors in the long run. And it also helps you deal with obsolescence. With sometimes a product's great, and then it gets starved in the next development cycle, and you're stuck with something that's gradually out of date because you did an investment. So having choice, having clean design so that you can flip out one technology and almost like a black box and put another one in, those are things that really help prevent lock-in concerns. And lock-in is growing, by the way, concerns. The survey that I had showed that it wasn't such a big issue. In the last couple surveys we did, it went up a couple percent as people are becoming more familiar with cloud, and they're recognizing that just because you're like Amazon, you're not always going to be a white hat, for example, or, so they realize that behavior is behavior in terms of driving profitability. So.
Yeah, I guess also to answer that question, you can hand the mic over while I'm answering. Containerization is a good way to allow you to migrate and make applications portable. Portability, yes, portability between, if we're talking about public clouds or et cetera, I think that's important. I think a lot of organizations, the executives are looking at a centralized PaaS strategy that can be on-prem as well as off-prem, so they can abstract out the public cloud entities and look at an open hybrid sort of model of how they operate and being able to use a cloud management platform to actually instantiate and move workloads between public clouds. So I think containerization is a good way to protect yourself from the risk side of the equation, which is vendor lock-in.
So can I add, so you said that word. One of the things that I said before in my presentation, that no matter what cloud you pick, there's not as much choice as when there was 10 years ago or 5 years ago on-prem. Right, on-prem, like some of the markets I cover, there's 15 or 20 vendors competing with each other. When you go to cloud, a specific cloud, there might be 1 or 2. And that's a terrible condition for lock-in. So one of the things that's interesting about containers is that all of the vendors that you might want to use or partner with are building everything into Docker images. And so they're basically shifting architecturally to understanding that they need to fit into containers. And what happens is that instead of having 2, you go back to 35. So within a couple of years, you'll have vendors, a richness, a wealth of vendors offering different things because they've all sort of surfed that container wave. That's the other reason that it's important. So thanks for reminding me about that. So.
Stephen?
Yep, no, these are great points already. I think at Red Hat we have a very specific feeling about this, which is an open standards type of a viewpoint, right? Obviously open source is in Red Hat's DNA, but it comes with open standards, and it's like, how do you actually have standard interfaces? And it's about how do you pick your different layers of abstraction. And I do think the container layer is a pretty amazing cutoff point now, because it gives you everything that you need above to basically run any type of code, but it allows you to abstract away a lot of the lower layers. And interestingly, the customers that I've talked to that use multiple clouds, I think that's now becoming extremely common. Most of them obviously can move workloads between the clouds, but one of the reasons they do that, it's not because, well, I'd like to be able to switch between Azure and AWS if the cost changes. It's actually because there happens to be on AWS a particular cloud service that they like for a particular application. And on Google Cloud, there's a different one that they need for a different application. And that's great. So they want to be on both clouds for functional reasons, not cost reasons. But they want to write the same type of code in both places. So how do you do that? So I think we're in an era where actually this gets easier. And the other point I would make is that APIs actually help a lot. If you put internal APIs, so rather than saying I'm going to install, like University of Berkeley did, right? They have Workday for a lot of their systems, but they didn't necessarily expose the Workday interface to their entire org. What they did is they put a cover over it so that in theory they could switch that out at some point. And even better, I think in certain industries you'll start to get very standard API interfaces, and you'll be able to demand of the vendor, like, do you support this? And I'm actually quite hopeful we'll get away from some of the really deep lock-in, and vendors will have to work hard for your money. That's certainly what we expect to do, and we hope that that's...
So sort of APIs as a way to abstract the clouds as well, and embedding the API in the container, the endpoint itself, so that it can migrate as well, is a good way to protect your interests from a vendor lock-in perspective. Is that it from the answers for the question? I probably have time for 1, maybe 2 questions. Anybody else want to ask a question? Or is everybody really hungry because it's lunchtime?
No, you have a question, ask it.
Come on up and ask.
He's
No
hungry,
problem.
and he has
No,
a
don't.
question.
Might as well keep it long,
Well, I mean, just out of respect for everyone's stomachs. I'm coming from a public organization where we exercise more of a corporately managed infrastructure base, and we're investigating the kind of multitude of APIs and that platform-based environment. And this kind of ties towards the second point that Stephen had in his presentation about ownership versus enablement. we have a lot of pressure to deliver agile developments, DevOps, et cetera, and we want to check that with integrity. And one thing I don't hear a lot about is security, and we're faced a lot with, we have the reality of security audits and that type of thing, accessibility and so forth, and we need to adapt language and concepts and what should we say towards that, and how do we make that transition from that corporate. I could direct to anyone that has, but it was tying that kind of did spark the question from my presentation.
Sure.
So security is my question. What do we?
Great question. Great question. Who wants to take that one?
I could start with it, but I think there's a couple other dimensions to it. So I definitely agree. I mean, I think that what you want to do is you want to enable people to create services and then maintain them over time rather than trying to centralize them all. But there's obviously a risk because not everybody is an expert in everything. And so I think that's where you need to provide tooling, you need to provide processes or cookbooks and unfortunately some rules and potentially even audits of those teams. So that's part of enablement is actually also some sense of governance that comes in. From an API perspective, obviously tools like ours allow you to set up default configurations that people use and so forth. So there are things that you can put out of the gate that essentially make it very difficult for someone to go around. Especially in our case, often the external API gateways, it's restricted how many you can use, but some of our customers run internally, each team runs their own API gateway, so there's kind of a different levels of it. One of the things I really like about, again, sort of container world is you can pre-configure the images that are available and you can start to put some rules in place with those, so the stock images already have some kind of thing in it that will start to restrict some of the behavior and make it easier so that each developer doesn't have to spin up that stuff and get it right out of the gate. So it's part education, part carrot, part stick, part tooling. And yeah, we've definitely worked with different organizations to try to get the communication strategy around the API part. I don't know if you could like a container dimension to this or an integration dimension or.
Yeah, I think what I would just like to add to what Steve said, well, it's more about creating a kind of like a process to do this experimentation. So you experiment with this, so you need the tooling around this. So when you create those APIs, I think APIs are a great way to now encapsulate all the business logic, right? I mean, that was one of the big problems with integration earlier, where you would have multiple different integration services, but now as you look into each one of them, you would now have security mechanisms for each one of them. But now when you think about creating as an API, you automatically start thinking about, okay, how do I, because the first thing that comes to your mind is, I want to share this. I want to like collaborate on this. And then automatically you start having those type of standards. Okay, who can access this? How many times you can? So you automatically, like what would happen in earlier thing was, oh, I create an integration service, I deploy it, and okay, it's going on. But now all the other concerns, you never thought about it. Here, when you look at an overall API approach, you, in the beginning of your design processes of like the thing that Steve had in his diagram about the design thing, you're now really thinking about this and you're experimenting, and with the tooling that is available with the containers and the API management, you're able to do it in a much more effective manner.
Anybody else want to handle that one?
I was just going to add that there's going to be groups, QA, security, these groups that have very specialized knowledge and skill. And I guess just to reinforce the idea that they're not going to be able to teach everybody to become security experts or QA experts or whatever, but that their expertise, to the extent that we can, we want to bake that into the automation. We want to bake that into our continuous integration and continuous delivery pipelines. We want to make that hard stuff easier to do by lowering the bar to have it be accomplished.
And to add to that, our position is automation, so continuous security as applications go from a developer's platform through development, through test. That all has to be all automated. There's various ways of doing that. From an audit compliance perspective, we also look at automation to help with the generating the documents for the auditors to go through and look at different sort of RBAC-based technologies to prove who actually did the work. And in some cases, some cases, honestly, we need to rethink about what security is, because, you know, a lot of organizations, financial ones specifically, you got to check and balance, right? You got to have one person do the work, another person has to check, and you got to know who those people are. In our case, you know, that might be fully automated now, so there's not actually a human being doing this stuff anymore. But I know in the very quick organizations where security is key, everything's been automated. All the different types of testing, continuous security, and different investments in like Open Escape and different ways of doing continuous security have been invested in so that they feel secure and they can meet the auditors and compliance. So there's a whole set of new tooling, I think, that Stephen mentioned. I think there's new processes, and there's a different philosophy when it comes to security. But keep in mind, you know, some of the largest public sector organizations around the world are doing this today. Province of BC is doing this today, and they actually ingest source code taken from the open source community to build their digital services through an agile procurement methodology. So that's a huge topic. I think we touched on a few parts. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add, but I think those are the big parts. So to answer your question, I'd be happy to talk to you later as well.